This year we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is one of the greatest legislative achievements in the history of our country. There were so many men and women who were important parts of the civil rights movement, but I'd like to take part of this time here to highlight one of them who has been especially important to me, and that was my father, who was a civil rights lawyer and who wrote much of the enforcement language behind the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is one of the greatest achievements of human rights in our nation's history. When he came back from the war, he thought about it for a while and decided that he wanted to spend part of his life in service to his fellow man. This was in the late 1940s and 50s at the birth of this modern civil rights movement. My dad had grown up in the South, and he saw firsthand the struggles for equality and for basic human rights. And he saw civil rights as the great cause of his generation. So he left behind his career in science and became a civil rights lawyer. There were 10 years after the historic Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education, that established the constitutional right of minority children to attend the same schools as everyone else, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And in those 10 years, my father spent much of the time traveling around the South, interviewing and offering advice to school districts that were struggling with the implications of Brown versus Board of Education. And then he served as sort of an informal advance man for the Justice Department. He would send back memos saying that, you know, in this one county there was one guy who ran the county, that he understood the tide of history, and that if you had to have Robert Kennedy or Burt Marshall or whoever was running the Justice Department, the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, if you could have him give him a call, that in this case the situation could be solved, but that in another county it was a lost cause, and the Justice Department should just plan on bringing in the troops and filing suit. And so it was as a result of this work, when the Civil Rights Act finally passed, my father was called upon to write what were referred to as the federal guidelines for implementing Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. These were the detailed rules that said year by year what each of the southern school districts had to do to desegregate their schools in order to qualify for federal funds. And with the carrot of federal funds for education and the stick provided by the federal guidelines of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, more school integration was achieved in the 1 year following the Civil Rights Act of 1964 than in the previous 10 years following Brown versus Board of Education. The Civil Rights Act did not happen instantaneously. It was the result of decades of work beforehand, and the struggles to fully implement its sweeping provisions are still things that we're continuing today. My father had the chance to work with some of the leaders of the civil rights movement. He knew Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy. He described having dinner at the kitchen table of Merle and Medgar Evers and holding their infant child in his hands only weeks before Medgar was shot down in his driveway. My father was not an activist or a protester, but he saw a great injustice and he quietly devoted himself to changing it. Martin Luther King famously said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. But the arc does not bend on its own. Change only happens when people, great and small, come up and demand it. On July 2nd, 1964, when President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law, the arc was bent toward justice, but only because of the tireless efforts of so many men and women who fought to bend it in the right direction. And I'm proud to say that my father was among them. In fact, it was his work on the Civil Rights Act, and it was actually reading through his papers after he passed away a few years ago, that I first started thinking about the fundamental question that everyone has to answer, which is, what fraction of my life should I be spending in service to my fellow man? I spent most of my career as a scientist, seeking answers to questions of absolute scientific truth, or in business, taking advantage of the latest technology. But there's that one question, science really doesn't help you at all with what fraction of your life you should spend in service to your fellow man. And the answer to that question does not come from science. It comes from the spirit inside each of us. And for me, the idea of not spending part of my life in service to my fellow man and helping others did not feel right. And that that's as much as anything why I decided to turn to public service. And that's why this conversation is important.